May 4, 1943. The early morning light crept across the rolling hills of the Italian countryside outside San Pietro, casting long shadows over the American encampment where Sergeant Elijah Washington of the 365th Infantry Regiment sat cleaning his equipment. At 37, he was older than most of his fellow soldiers, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as they had for nearly 20 years in the coal mines of West Virginia. The regiment believed they would break through the German defensive line within 48 hours through conventional assault tactics, unaware that the most significant breakthrough would come from a technique the military experts had repeatedly dismissed as impractical nonsense. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how an unconventional solution, born in the darkness of American coal mines, would transform battlefield tactics against reinforced positions, and how a man whose expertise had been systematically ignored would save hundreds of lives through an innovation that military engineers would later adopt across multiple theaters of war. The 365th Infantry Regiment was part of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the few segregated African-American divisions in the United States Army during World War II. Known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a nickname carried over from the historical black cavalry units, they faced not only the German opposition, but also the persistent skepticism of their own military leadership. "Another day of banging our heads against that concrete wall," said Private James Tanner, a 22-year-old from Philadelphia who had joined the Army just 14 months prior. He nodded toward the distant hills where German fortifications had halted the Allied advance for nearly 2 weeks. "Those bunkers were designed to withstand direct artillery strikes," said Lieutenant Robert Miller, the white officer assigned to their company. "Headquarters says we need at least 3 more days of concentrated bombardment before we can attempt another frontal assault." Sergeant Washington remained silent, turning a small leather pouch of coal dust in his hands. He had carried it with him since leaving the mines of Beckley, West Virginia, partly as a reminder of home and partly because old habits die hard. For nearly 2 decades, he had worked the deep tunnels of the New River coalfields, eventually becoming one of the few black blasting specialists before the war called him to service. "Something on your mind, Washington?" Lieutenant Miller asked, noticing the sergeant's contemplative expression. "Just thinking about those bunkers, sir," Washington replied. "Reminds me of a problem we had back in the mines with a particularly stubborn limestone seam." "This isn't a coal mine, Sergeant," Miller said, his voice carrying the familiar tone of dismissal that Washington had grown accustomed to. "German engineering is considerably more sophisticated than your limestone." Washington nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." That evening, as the company received their orders for the next day's operation, Washington sat with Corporal Marcus Johnson, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh, and Staff Sergeant William Hayes, who had taught mathematics at a segregated school in Georgia before the war. "They're sending us in tomorrow afternoon," Hayes said quietly, "after the morning artillery barrage. Command thinks they might have weakened the eastern bunker enough for a breakthrough." Johnson scoffed. "That's what they said 3 days ago. Lost 17 men finding out they were wrong." Washington unfolded a rough sketch he had been working on throughout the day. "I've been thinking about those bunkers. The Germans built them smart, anchoring them deep and reinforcing the facing walls. That's why the artillery isn't having much effect. It's hitting at the wrong angle." Hayes studied the drawing with interest. "What are you suggesting, Elijah?" "Back in the mines, when we hit formations too dense for conventional blasting, we use something called controlled differential pressure," Washington explained. "Instead of trying to shatter the rock directly, we'd create a pressure wave that would exploit existing weaknesses." "And how exactly would we apply mining techniques to a military bunker?" Johnson asked. Washington pointed to the ventilation systems he had observed through his field binoculars. "Those bunkers need air. The Germans built these fortifications to withstand frontal assaults, but they still need to breathe." For the next hour, Washington explained his idea, drawing from his years of experience in the mines. His plan involved using a precise combination of conventional explosives and coal dust, a technique that had accidentally collapsed an entire section of the mine back in 1937, nearly killing him and 3 other miners. You want to create a dust explosion inside their ventilation system? Hayes asked, his mathematical mind already calculating the possibilities. Precisely, Washington confirmed. A small primary charge followed by the introduction of coal dust into a confined space creates an explosive force far greater than the original charge alone. We used to call it the multiplier back in the mines. It's why coal mines are so dangerous and why proper ventilation is so crucial. And you think this could work on a bunker? Johnson remained skeptical. In theory, yes, the principle is the same. If we can introduce the right mixture into their air system and detonate it properly, the pressure wave would travel throughout the entire structure. Instead of trying to break through the reinforced walls, we make the whole interior space into the explosive device. The following morning, Washington approached Lieutenant Miller with his plan, carefully explaining the scientific principles behind coal dust explosions and how they could be applied to the current tactical problem. Miller listened with obvious skepticism. So you want me to delay a military operation approved by battalion command because you think you can blow up a German bunker with coal dust? Miller's tone made his opinion clear. Not just coal dust, sir, Washington clarified. A precisely timed combination of conventional explosives and particulate disbursement. The principle is sound. It's basic physics and chemistry. And where exactly did you study physics and chemistry, Sergeant? Miller asked. Washington stood straighter. 20 years in the coal mines, sir, and I've seen what happens when these principles are applied, both intentionally and accidentally. I lost friends to dust explosions. I've also used controlled versions to break through formations that conventional methods couldn't touch. Miller sighed. Washington, I respect your experience as a miner, but this is warfare against German fortifications designed by professional engineers. Sir, with respect, those engineers still have to account for basic physical laws. No matter how well built, that bunker needs air circulation. That's its vulnerability. After further discussion and the intervention of Captain Thomas Wilson, the company commander, who had developed a grudging respect for Washington's practical intelligence, a compromise was reached. Washington would be allowed to attempt his approach with a small team during the next night's operation, while the main assault would proceed as planned the following day. That night, Washington led a 5-man team including Johnson, Hayes, and 2 other soldiers from mining backgrounds, Private First Class Samuel Lewis from the coal country of Kentucky, and Private Diego Morales, who had worked in copper mines in Arizona. They carried with them conventional explosives, several pouches of coal dust Washington had been collecting and drying for days, and a specialized delivery system Hayes and Washington had designed using available materials. The approach to the bunker was treacherous. German machine gun positions covered the likely avenues of attack, and flares periodically illuminated the landscape. The team utilized the natural contours of the land, moving slowly and methodically toward their target. Remember, once we're in position, absolute silence, Washington whispered, as they neared the first ventilation outlet he had identified during previous observations. The initial charge needs to be placed precisely, and the dust needs to be introduced in the right quantity and at the right moment. Private Lewis nodded nervously. Just like setting charges in the Cumberland seam, right, Sarge? Washington smiled grimly. Just like that, except the mountain shoots back. The German bunker was an impressive feat of engineering. Constructed with reinforced concrete nearly 6 feet thick in places, it was designed to house up to 40 soldiers and included machine gun positions, ammunition storage, and living quarters. Most importantly for Washington's plan, it featured a ventilation system necessary to remove carbon dioxide and bring fresh air to the occupants. The team reached the smallest of the ventilation outlets, a reinforced pipe approximately 18 inches in diameter, protected by a metal grate. Working in near-total darkness, they carefully removed the grate, conscious that any unusual noise might alert the German sentries. "This is where it gets technical," Washington whispered, removing the specially prepared charges from his pack. "Hayes, check the airflow." Hayes held a small piece of cloth near the opening, observing its movement. "Inflow, steady, and moderate," he confirmed. "Just as we predicted for this time of night." Washington nodded. Temperature differences between day and night created predictable airflow patterns in ventilation systems. knowledge that had saved his life more than once in the mines. The team prepared the first stage of their plan, a shaped charge designed to create an opening further inside the ventilation shaft without causing a catastrophic explosion. This would be followed by the introduction of the coal dust mixture at precisely the right moment, and finally, a second charge to ignite the dust cloud once it had dispersed optimally within the bunker's interior. Timing is everything, Washington reminded them as they set the first charge. Too soon and the dust won't be properly dispersed. Too late, and it might settle or the airflow could change. The first charge was detonated, a muffled thump that sounded no louder than a distant shell landing. Washington immediately began introducing the coal dust mixture into the ventilation shaft, using a hand-pumped bellows they had fashioned from medical supplies. Hayes monitored the time with intense concentration. 15 seconds, he whispered, as Washington continued pumping the fine black dust into the airflow. 20 seconds. At precisely 30 seconds, Washington inserted the second charge, designed to create the spark necessary to ignite the now dispersed coal dust cloud that would be forming inside the bunker's main chambers. "Fire in the hole," he whispered, an old miner's call that had become second nature. The team retreated to a safe distance and waited. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Johnson looked at Washington with doubt beginning to show in his eyes. Then the ground beneath them shuddered. The effect was unlike a conventional explosion. Instead of a dramatic blast and debris being thrown outward, there was a deep, resonant rumble, followed by what sounded like a massive intake of breath. Then the bunker seemed to shudder and settle, dust and debris emerging from every opening as the internal pressure wave dissipated. From inside came muffled shouts of confusion and alarm. "Did it work?" Lewis whispered. Washington was already observing through his field glasses. "Look at the main gun position." The heavy machine gun that had dominated the approach to the bunker was silent, its crew apparently displaced by the internal explosion. More tellingly, the reinforced door on the bunker's eastern side hung askew, thrown partially open by the pressure wave. "I'll be damned," Johnson muttered. "It actually worked." "Physics doesn't care what uniform you're wearing," Washington replied. Her confined dust explosion creates the same pressure wave whether it's in a coal mine or a German bunker. The team quickly signaled to the waiting company with a series of light flashes, indicating that their approach had been successful. Within minutes, a platoon led by Lieutenant Miller advanced toward the compromised bunker. The German defenders, disoriented by the unusual explosion that had filled their fortress with dust and smoke, while creating a devastating pressure wave that ruptured eardrums and threw men against walls, offered only sporadic resistance. Within 20 minutes, the bunker that had halted the Allied advance for 2 weeks was secured, with 27 German soldiers surrendering and 11 others found unconscious from the effects of the blast. Lieutenant Miller found Washington outside the captured bunker, examining its structure with professional interest. "I don't understand exactly what happened in there," Miller admitted, "but whatever you did, it worked. The Germans inside said they thought the whole mountain had collapsed on them." Washington nodded. "The principles of dust explosion have been understood for centuries, sir. It's just a matter of applying that knowledge correctly." Miller extended his hand, a gesture that crossed significant racial boundaries in 1943. "Well done, Sergeant. I'll make sure command hears about this." Word of the innovative technique spread quickly through the ranks. Captain Wilson, recognizing the potential strategic value, arranged for Washington to demonstrate the method to a group of combat engineers the following day. Among them was Major James Hartford of the Corps of Engineers, who immediately grasped the broader applications of Washington's approach. "You're telling me this technique could be adapted to other fortified positions?" Hartford asked, examining Washington's diagrams with growing interest. "Yes, sir," Washington confirmed. "Any enclosed structure that requires air circulation is potentially vulnerable to this approach. The dust doesn't have to be coal either. Flour, grain, certain types of soil. Even finely ground chalk can create explosive disbursement under the right conditions." Major Hartford shook his head in wonderment. "And the military has been trying to solve this problem with bigger artillery and more direct firepower. Sometimes force multiplication is more effective than force escalation, sir," Washington replied. "Where did you learn to think this way, Sergeant?" Hartford asked. Washington thought about the question for a moment. Necessity, sir. In the mines, we couldn't just use more explosives when we hit a problem. That would risk collapse. We had to find smarter ways to apply the resources we had. Over the next week, Washington worked with the engineering corps to refine and formalize his technique. They developed standardized procedures, tested various dust compounds for effectiveness and portability, and created specialized delivery systems that could be manufactured and distributed to combat units. The technique, officially designated as differential pressure exploitation, but quickly nicknamed Washington's method by the men who used it, would go on to be employed successfully against dozens of German bunkers and fortified positions across Italy and later in France following the Normandy landings. For Sergeant Elijah Washington, the recognition was bittersweet. While his innovation saved countless American lives and significantly accelerated the Allied advance, the prevailing racial attitudes of the time ensured that his contribution would remain largely uncelebrated in official military histories. Captain Wilson, to his credit, submitted Washington for the Bronze Star with a detailed account of his contribution. The medal was awarded 3 months later in a small ceremony that received little attention outside the 92nd Infantry Division. "You deserve more recognition than this," Hayes told him after the ceremony. Washington shrugged. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it needed doing, and because I knew it would work." "Still," Johnson added, "someday people should know the real story." "Maybe they will," Washington replied, "but for now winning this war is what matters." As summer turned to fall in 1943, the Buffalo Soldiers continued their advance through Italy, with Washington's technique becoming an integral part of their tactical approach to fortified positions. The same military establishment that had initially dismissed his idea as impractical nonsense now included it in combat engineering manuals, though rarely with full credit to its originator. For Washington, there was a certain irony in this. The knowledge he had gained in the segregated coal mines of West Virginia, working in conditions white miners would have refused, had provided him with insights that conventional military thinking had overlooked. The very marginalization that had defined much of his life had given him a perspective that proved invaluable on the battlefields of Europe. One evening in October, as the regiment prepared for yet another advance, Washington received unexpected news. Major Hartford had arranged for him to be temporarily reassigned to a special engineering unit tasked with adapting his technique for use in the Pacific Theater against Japanese bunkers. "They want me to leave the regiment?" Washington asked, surprised by the development. "Just temporarily," Captain Wilson explained. "Your expertise is needed to train other units. It's a compliment, Sergeant. Your method is changing how we approach fortified positions across both theaters of the war." Washington looked around at the men he had served with for nearly 2 years, men who had become a kind of family, despite the hardships they faced both from the enemy and from the prejudice within their own army. "Request permission to decline the reassignment, sir," Washington said after a moment's consideration. "Decline?" Wilson was taken aback. "This is an opportunity, Washington. You'd be working directly with command-level engineering units." "With respect, sir, my place is here with my men. We've developed these techniques together, and they work because we understand them as a unit. I'd rather continue applying them directly than teaching others from a distance." Wilson studied him thoughtfully. "You're certain about this? It could mean advancement, possibly a commission eventually." Washington smiled slightly. "I'm a coal miner who happens to be wearing a uniform, sir. I know where I belong and where I can do the most good." After a moment, Wilson nodded. "Very well, I'll inform Major Hartford, but I warn you he won't be pleased." "Thank you, sir." Later that night, Washington sat with Hayes and Johnson, sharing their meager rations as they prepared for the next day's operation. The conversation turned to what they might do after the war, if they survived. "I might go back to teaching," Hayes said, "though I hope things will be different by then. This war is supposedly about freedom. Maybe some of that freedom will find its way back home." Johnson nodded. "I hear Ford and some of the other big manufacturers might be hiring veterans, regardless of color. Good wages in those factories." "What about you, Elijah?" Hayes asked. "Back to the mines?" Washington considered the question. "I don't know. Maybe. though I've been thinking about starting something of my own. My father always wanted to run his own business. Never got the chance. Maybe I'll do it for him. A blasting company? Johnson suggested with a smile. Washington laughed. Perhaps. Or maybe something entirely different. This war has shown me that the knowledge we bring from our previous lives has value in unexpected places. There might be other applications I haven't considered yet. As night fell across the Italian countryside, Washington reviewed the maps for the next day's objective, another German defensive position blocking the Allied advance. Already his mind was analyzing the structure, identifying potential vulnerabilities, and formulating an approach that would minimize casualties on both sides. The skills that had kept him alive in the dangerous depths of the coal mines were now saving lives on the battlefields of Europe. It was not the recognition he had sought, but it was a purpose that gave meaning to the hardships he had endured throughout his life. The following morning, as dawn broke over the hills, Washington led his team toward yet another German bunker, carrying with him the wisdom of the mines and the determination that had defined his journey from the coal seams of West Virginia to the front lines of World War II. The technique that had been dismissed as stupid by military experts was about to collapse another enemy stronghold, bringing the Allied forces one step closer to victory and writing another unrecognized chapter in the history of American innovation. As they moved forward under cover of early morning fog, Private Lewis whispered, "Do you ever wonder if anyone will remember what we did here, Sarge?" Washington checked his equipment one final time before replying, "History has a way of finding the truth eventually, Lewis. All we can do is make sure we give it something worth remembering." By mid-morning, the sound of another successful application of Washington's method would echo across the valley, and another seemingly impregnable fortress would fall to the innovation born in the darkness of American coal mines and brought to light on the battlefields of World War II, November 12, 1943. The Italian winter had begun to settle across the countryside, bringing with it persistent rain and plummeting temperatures that transformed the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and misery. The 365th Infantry Regiment had advanced another 20 miles since Washington's technique had first proven successful, but progress had slowed considerably as German resistance stiffened and the weather deteriorated. In a partially collapsed farmhouse that now served as the company's temporary headquarters, Captain Wilson gathered his non-commissioned officers for a briefing. Maps covered a weathered wooden table illuminated by lanterns that cast long shadows across the concerned faces of the men. "Intelligence reports a major defensive position 3 miles ahead," Wilson explained, pointing to markings on the map. "The Germans have converted an ancient monastery into what they're calling a Festungspunkt, a fortress point. Reconnaissance indicates at least 3 interconnected bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, all built into the existing stone structure. Battalion wants it taken within 48 hours to maintain our timetable for reaching the next strategic objective." "What kind of support will we have, sir?" asked Staff Sergeant Hayes, studying the topographical features surrounding the monastery. "Limited artillery due to concerns about historical preservation," Wilson replied with a grimace. "Apparently, someone at headquarters is worried about damaging a 14th century fresco inside the main chapel. Politics and art appreciation are complicating our war effort." Washington examined the aerial photographs that accompanied the maps. "These structures appear significantly larger than the bunkers we've encountered previously, Captain. The stone walls of the original monastery are nearly 4 feet thick in some sections, according to these measurements." "That's why you're here, Washington," Wilson said. "Your method has become our best option for dealing with reinforced positions without extensive artillery support. The question is, can it be scaled up for something of this size?" Washington considered the problem carefully. "The principle remains the same, sir, regardless of size. If anything, a larger interior volume could potentially enhance the effect of a properly executed dust explosion. The challenge will be delivery and timing." "What do you need?" Wilson asked. "More dust material, for one thing," Washington replied. "We've nearly exhausted our coal dust supplies, but I've been experimenting with alternatives. Flour, fine soil, even pulverized limestone can work if properly prepared." "The supply officer mentioned a grain mill about a mile back," Corporal Johnson interjected. Abandoned, but the equipment might still be there. Good thinking, Washington nodded. We'll also need more delivery capacity, larger bellows or multiple insertion points. And most importantly, we need detailed information about the ventilation system. These older structures often have chimney networks that might be connected to the newer construction. Captain Wilson made notes as Washington outlined his requirements. I'll assign a reconnaissance team to gather more specific intelligence on the ventilation aspects. Johnson, take a squad to check out that grain mill. Hayes, work with Washington on modifying the delivery systems. As the meeting concluded, Lieutenant Miller, whose initial skepticism about Washington's technique had transformed into cautious respect over the past months, approached the sergeant. The Germans will have adapted by now, Miller said quietly. Word of our methods has undoubtedly spread through their ranks. They won't make it easy to access their air circulation systems. Washington nodded gravely. I've been thinking the same thing, sir. We'll need to modify our approach, perhaps create a diversion to draw attention away from the actual insertion points. I have some ideas about that, Miller offered. If you have time later, perhaps we could discuss them. I'd appreciate that, Lieutenant. The evolution of Miller's attitude toward Washington reflected a broader shift within the company. Success had a way of eroding prejudice, at least within the confined context of combat, where results mattered more than race. It wasn't equality or justice by any civilian standard, but it represented a pragmatic acknowledgement of capability that Washington had rarely experienced before the war. The next 24 hours were a flurry of preparation. Johnson's team returned from the abandoned mill with several hundred pounds of wheat flour and cornmeal. Not ideal materials, but workable when properly dried and sifted to achieve the optimal particle size for combustion. Hayes and Washington worked with the company's mechanics to modify their delivery systems, creating larger capacity bellows and extending the tubing to allow for greater standoff distance during operation. Meanwhile, a reconnaissance patrol returned with crucial information about the monastery's construction. The original medieval structure featured an extensive network of chimneys connected to fireplaces throughout the building. German engineers had incorporated these existing features into their ventilation system, adding modern fans in some locations while blocking other openings for defensive purposes. They've installed machine gun positions covering most of the obvious approach routes, reported Sergeant Paul Martinez, who had led the reconnaissance team. But there's a drainage culvert on the eastern side that might provide cover for an approach to one of the original kitchen chimneys. It's partially collapsed, so it would be a tight squeeze. Washington studied the rough sketches Martinez had made. That could work. How close to the main structure does this culvert get us? About 30 yards at its closest point. There's a section of dead ground there that their machine guns can't cover effectively. Washington nodded thoughtfully. We'll need to split into 2 teams. The primary insertion team will use this approach, while a second team creates a diversion on the opposite side. The plan took shape over the next several hours. Lieutenant Miller would lead a diversionary force that would simulate an attack from the western approach, complete with controlled explosions designed to appear as an artillery barrage. Meanwhile, Washington would lead the primary team, including Hayes, Johnson, and 3 other soldiers with experience in their technique, to approach via the drainage culvert and target the kitchen chimney for their dust insertion. The operation was scheduled to begin at 0400 hours the following morning, timing chosen to coincide with the lowest expected level of alertness among the German defenders. As the men made their final preparations, an unexpected visitor arrived at their position, Major James Hartford of the Corps of Engineers, the same officer who had attempted to recruit Washington for his special unit months earlier. I was in the area overseeing some bridge repairs when I heard about this operation, Hartford explained to Captain Wilson. Thought I might observe if that's acceptable. Washington's method has been adopted by several other units, but none have employed it as effectively as your company. Wilson glanced at Washington, who gave a slight nod. We'd be honored, Major, though I should warn you, this will be our most challenging application yet. All the more reason to observe, Hartford replied. The Corps is very interested in documenting this technique for wider implementation. As night fell, the teams made their final preparations. Washington sat alone outside the farmhouse, meticulously checking the specialized charges they would use. Hayes found him there, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Everything all right, Elijah?" he asked, sitting beside his friend. Washington nodded slowly. "Just thinking about how far we've come with this. From a desperate improvisation to a formal military tactic in just a few months." "You should be proud," Hayes said. "Your innovation has saved countless lives, on both sides really. These positions would otherwise require massive bombardment or costly frontal assaults." "I am proud," Washington admitted, "though I keep thinking about the irony. Back home, men like us wouldn't be allowed to eat in the same restaurants as Major Hartford. Here, he's traveled miles to learn from me." Hayes smiled wryly. "War has a way of temporarily suspending certain absurdities. The question is whether any of that suspension survives once the shooting stops." "That's the real battle, isn't it?" Washington said quietly. "The one waiting for us back home." "One war at a time, my friend," Hayes replied, patting Washington's shoulder. "Let's survive this one first." In the pre-dawn darkness, the teams moved out toward their objectives. Washington led his group through the muddy terrain toward the drainage culvert, each man carrying components of their specialized equipment. The night was mercifully clear, with just enough moonlight to navigate by without making them overly visible to sentries. "Remember, absolute silence until the diversion begins," Washington whispered as they reached the culvert entrance. "Once Miller's team initiates their distraction, we'll have approximately 20 minutes to complete our insertion before the Germans realize it's not the main attack." The culvert was even narrower than Martinez's description had suggested, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, with several inches of cold water flowing along its bottom. Washington led the way, inching forward on elbows and knees, the vital equipment secured in waterproof pouches strapped to his back. The confined space would have triggered panic in many men, but Washington was accustomed to tight quarters from his years in the mines. He moved steadily forward, counting his breaths to estimate distance traveled, until he finally reached the partial collapse that Martinez had described. "Tight squeeze ahead," he whispered back to the others, "one at a time through this section." Washington removed his gear and pushed it through the narrow opening before contorting his body to follow. The jagged edges of broken concrete scraped against his uniform, but he pressed forward, emerging finally into a slightly wider section of the culvert. One by one, the other men followed, each facing his own moment of claustrophobic challenge before breaking through. Hayes, the last to attempt the passage, found himself briefly stuck, his broader shoulders wedged between the concrete edges. "I can't," he began, panic edging into his voice. "Easy, William," Washington whispered, reaching back through the gap to grasp Hayes's hand. "Exhale completely. Turn your shoulders just a quarter turn to the left and push when I pull." The technique worked, and Hayes slid through, breathing heavily as relief flooded through him. "Thank you," he managed between breaths. "Mining teaches you how to handle tight spaces," Washington replied. "Now let's keep moving. We should be nearing the exit point." They continued forward until Washington detected a subtle change in the airflow, an indication they were approaching an opening. Carefully, he raised his head to peer out of the culvert's exit. They had emerged precisely where Martinez's reconnaissance had indicated, a depression in the ground approximately 30 yards from the monastery's eastern wall, hidden from direct observation by a slight rise in the terrain. In the distance, they could hear the German sentries calling to one another, their voices carrying clearly in the cold night air. Washington checked his watch. 3 minutes until the diversion. Get the equipment ready. The men quickly assembled their modified delivery system, larger and more powerful than their previous versions, capable of pumping a significantly greater volume of dust into the monastery's ventilation network. Johnson carefully prepared the initial charges, designed to breach any obstructions within the chimney system without causing a premature ignition of the dust cloud. Precisely on schedule, the sound of explosions erupted from the western side of the monastery. Lieutenant Miller's diversionary attack had begun, with carefully placed charges simulating artillery impacts. German shouts of alarm could be heard, followed by the distinctive sound of machine gun fire as the defenders responded to the perceived threat. "That's our cue," Washington said. "Let's move." The team advanced quickly across the open ground, staying low in the darkness. They reached the exterior wall without incident, quickly locating the ancient stone chimney that Martinez had identified. Centuries old, it protruded slightly from the main wall, constructed of weathered granite blocks with a square opening approximately 2 feet wide. Johnson carefully placed the initial charge, while Hayes and the others prepared the bellows system. Washington conducted a final check of the airflow, using a small piece of cloth to confirm the chimney was drawing inward, a crucial factor for their plan to succeed. "Airflow is optimal," Washington confirmed. "Prepare the primary dust charge and set the timer for 90 seconds. That should give us enough time to reach safe distance after initiation." The process was more complex than their previous operations. First, Johnson's initial charge was detonated, a muffled thump that was barely audible over the continuing sounds of the diversionary attack. This cleared any obstructions in the chimney system. Next, the team activated their modified bellows, pumping hundreds of pounds of finely sifted flour and cornmeal into the ventilation network. Hayes monitored the timing with precision, while Washington observed the dust flow to ensure proper disbursement. Finally, as the last of the dust disappeared into the chimney, Washington inserted the ignition charge, set to detonate after a carefully calculated delay, long enough for the dust to spread throughout the internal spaces of the monastery, but not so long that it would begin to settle. "Charge is set, 90 seconds and counting," Washington announced. "Let's move." The team retreated quickly toward the culvert, counting down the seconds as they moved. They had just reached the relative safety of the depression when the timer reached 0. The effect was dramatically different from their previous operations. Instead of a muffled rumble, the monastery seemed to exhale a massive breath of fire. Flames erupted briefly from every window, chimney, and ventilation port, a split-second inferno that illuminated the night sky. Then came the concussive wave, a deep, resonant boom that they felt in their bones more than heard with their ears. The ancient stone walls, which had withstood centuries of weather and war, remained largely intact due to their massive construction. But within those walls, the pressure wave had wreaked havoc on the German defenses. Machine gun positions fell silent. The sounds of confusion and alarm echoed across the battlefield. "My God," Hayes whispered, staring at the monastery. "That was at least 5 times more powerful than any of our previous attempts." "The flour," Washington explained. "It has a higher energy density than coal dust, and the larger interior volume of the monastery allowed for optimal disbursement. Perfect conditions for a maximum effect dust explosion." From their position, they could see German soldiers emerging from secondary exits, many disoriented, some helping wounded comrades. The defensive position that had been expected to delay the Allied advance for days had been effectively neutralized in a single operation. Captain Wilson's voice came through on their field radio. "Primary team, report status." "Mission accomplished, sir," Washington replied. "Target neutralized. Recommend immediate advance to secure the position before they can reorganize." "Acknowledged. Hold position until the main force reaches you." "Well done, Washington." The company moved quickly to secure the monastery, encountering only sporadic and disorganized resistance. Within 30 minutes, the position was under American control, with 43 German prisoners taken, most suffering from temporary hearing loss, disorientation, and minor burns, but alive. Major Hartford found Washington as the sergeant was examining the interior of the monastery, assessing the effects of their operation. "Remarkable," Hartford said, surveying the damage. "The pressure wave collapsed internal walls and disabled their equipment, but left the primary structure intact. Even that fresco headquarters was concerned about appears largely undamaged." Washington nodded, studying the pattern of destruction with professional interest. "Dust explosions create a rapid pressure front that distributes force relatively evenly through confined spaces. It's actually less destructive to solid masonry than conventional explosives, which create localized points of extreme force." Hartford shook his head in amazement. "You know, Washington, the Corps of Engineers has dozens of officers with advanced degrees in structural engineering, and none of them conceptualized this approach. Yet you developed it from practical experience in the coal mines." "Different perspectives lead to different solutions, sir," Washington replied diplomatically. "Indeed they do," Hartford agreed, "which is why I'm here with new orders for you." Washington looked up in surprise. These come directly from Corps headquarters, Hartford continued, producing an official document. You're being temporarily assigned to a special engineering unit for the next 3 weeks. No arguments this time, Sergeant. This isn't just about training others in your method anymore. What is it about, sir? The Allied command is planning major operations against hardened German positions in preparation for what will eventually become the invasion of France. Your expertise is needed to help adapt your technique for much larger targets, coastal fortifications, underground command centers, and the like. Washington felt conflicted. His loyalty to his unit ran deep, yet he understood the strategic importance of what Hartford was proposing. My men are trained in the procedure now, sir. They can continue implementing it here in Italy. They can, Hartford agreed, but no one understands the underlying principles as thoroughly as you do. This is about scaling your innovation to meet entirely new challenges. 3 weeks, Washington. Then you return to your unit with full credit for your contribution. After consulting with Captain Wilson, who reluctantly concurred with the reassignment, Washington prepared to depart. His team gathered to see him off as a transport jeep arrived to take him to the airfield. Don't let these engineers take all the credit for your idea, Johnson said as they shook hands. Make sure they spell your name right in the reports, Hayes added with a smile. Washington looked at the men he had served with through months of combat. Keep improving the technique while I'm gone. I expect to find you've made it even better when I return. You can count on that, Sarge, Private Lewis promised. Washington's temporary assignment took him first to Naples, then to a classified facility in England where Allied engineers were developing strategies for the eventual cross-channel invasion. The scale of the operation was unlike anything he had previously imagined, with thousands of personnel working on countless aspects of what would become the largest amphibious assault in military history. The special engineering unit he joined was tasked with developing methods to neutralize German coastal defenses. Massive concrete bunkers and gun emplacements built as part of what the Germans called the Atlantic Wall. Washington found himself working alongside British and American officers with impressive academic credentials, yet his practical knowledge quickly earned their respect. The fundamental challenge is scale, explained Colonel Richard Brennan, the unit's commander, during their initial briefing. The bunkers you've encountered in Italy are relatively small compared to the coastal fortifications we'll face. Some have walls over 3 meters thick and interior volumes 20 times larger than anything you've dealt with previously. The principles remain the same, sir, Washington replied. Though the quantities and delivery methods will need significant adaptation. For the next 2 weeks, Washington worked closely with the engineering team, conducting tests and developing specialized equipment for what they now formally called pressure front disbursement, a technique that combined elements of his original approach with new technologies developed specifically for the larger targets they would face. During this period, Washington received 2 pieces of news that affected him deeply. The first was that Lieutenant Miller had been killed during an operation near Bologna. The officer who had initially dismissed his idea, but later become one of its strongest advocates, had died, leading his men against a German counterattack. The second was a letter from his wife, Rebecca, informing him that his youngest brother, Thomas, had been denied employment at the very coal mine where Washington had worked before the war, despite severe labor shortages. The reason given was unsuitability, a transparent euphemism for racial discrimination. These reminders of the realities waiting at home tempered Washington's sense of accomplishment in England. One evening, as he sat alone reviewing technical diagrams, he was surprised by a visit from an unexpected figure, General Omar Bradley, who was overseeing much of the planning for the cross-channel invasion. "So you're the coal miner who's been revolutionizing our approach to German fortifications," Bradley said, taking a seat across from Washington. "Colonel Brennan speaks very highly of your contributions." "Thank you, sir," Washington replied, somewhat overwhelmed by the presence of such a high-ranking officer. "I'm just applying what I learned in the mines to the problems we're facing here." Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "That's precisely what interests me, Sergeant. This war has taught us that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. Your background gave you insights that our conventional military thinking overlooked." The general examined some of the technical drawings on the table. "These adaptations for the Atlantic wall bunkers, they're your work." "A collaborative effort, sir. The engineering team has contributed significantly to the scaling and delivery aspects. But the core concept remains yours," Bradley observed. "Brennan tells me this approach could save thousands of lives during the initial assaults." Washington thought carefully before responding. "If implemented properly, yes, sir, though there are still considerable challenges to overcome." "There always are," Bradley agreed. "War is ultimately a series of problems that must be solved under the worst possible conditions." He paused, studying Washington with evident curiosity. "What will you do after the war, Sergeant? Return to the mines?" The question caught Washington off guard. Few white men of Bradley's stature had ever expressed interest in his future plans. "I haven't decided, sir. The mines provided steady work, but this war has opened my eyes to other possibilities." Bradley nodded. "Men with your problem-solving abilities will be needed to rebuild what this war has destroyed. I hope you'll find opportunities worthy of your talents." He rose to leave, but paused. "I've approved a commendation for your contribution to the war effort, Sergeant. It's a small recognition, but perhaps it might open some doors when you return home." After Bradley departed, Washington sat contemplating their conversation. The general's words had been kind, but Washington harbored no illusions about the America to which he would eventually return. A commendation might impress military men, but it would do little to change the fundamental realities of race in civilian life. As his 3-week assignment neared its conclusion, Washington completed his final contribution to the engineering project, a comprehensive manual documenting the scientific principles behind his technique and the various applications developed during his time with the unit. The document, running to over 70 pages of detailed instructions and diagrams, represented the formalization of knowledge he had acquired through years of practical experience, now translated into the language of professional engineering. Colonel Brennan reviewed the manual with evident satisfaction. "This is excellent work, Washington. With this documentation, your method can be properly implemented across multiple theaters of operation." "I'm glad to have been of service, sir," Washington replied, "though I'm also looking forward to rejoining my unit." "About that," Brennan said, his expression shifting slightly, "there's been a change of plans. Division Headquarters has requested that you remain with the Engineering Corps for the duration of your European deployment. They believe your expertise would be more valuable here than in a frontline infantry role." Washington frowned. "Sir, I made a commitment to my men. They're expecting me to return. I understand your loyalty, Sergeant, and it's commendable, but this comes from well above my level of authority. The work you're doing here could affect the entire European theater of operations." Despite his protests, Washington's reassignment became permanent. He continued to develop and refine his technique, eventually training specialized teams that would implement it during the Normandy landings and subsequent operations in France. Though he maintained correspondence with Hayes and others from his original unit, he never served with them again in combat. In many ways, this transfer marked the beginning of Washington's transition from soldier to technical specialist, a role that would ultimately shape his post-war life in unexpected ways. The stupid trick that had been dismissed by military experts had evolved into a sophisticated engineering technique, with Washington himself transformed from a combat sergeant to a valued consultant. As the war in Europe progressed toward its eventual conclusion, Washington's contribution continued to save Allied lives across multiple battlefields. The technique he had developed was used successfully during the Normandy landings, the liberation of Paris, and even in the final push into Germany itself. Though he remained largely uncredited in official military histories, his innovation became an established part of Allied combat engineering. When victory in Europe was finally declared in May 1945, Washington was stationed at an engineering facility in southern England, still developing adaptations of his technique for potential use in the Pacific Theater. The news reached him as he was working on a particularly challenging problem involving underwater applications. "It's over, Sergeant," announced Captain Lewis Reynolds, his current commanding officer. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally." A cheer erupted from the men in the facility, But Washington remained quiet, contemplating the long journey that had brought him to this moment. From the coal mines of West Virginia to the engineering labs of England, his path had been neither planned nor probable, but rather the result of necessity, opportunity, and his own innate ingenuity. In July 1945, Sergeant Elijah Washington finally returned home to Beckley, West Virginia, his military service complete. He arrived to a mixed reception, celebrated by his family and the local black community, but largely ignored by the white establishment that controlled the mines and most other aspects of economic life in the region. The commendation General Bradley had mentioned was indeed included in his service record, along with the Bronze Star he had received earlier in the war. But as Washington had anticipated, these military honors carried little weight in civilian society, particularly in the segregated South. His first attempt to find employment after the war brought this reality into sharp focus. When he applied for an engineering position with a mining company, work for which his military experience had uniquely qualified him, the personnel manager barely glanced at his service record. "So you don't have positions for colored men in the engineering department," the man explained without embarrassment, "but we are hiring miners. You could return to your old position." Washington declined the offer. The war had changed him in ways that made a return to his previous life impossible. The recognition he had received, limited though it was by the prejudices of the time, had confirmed what he had always suspected. His knowledge and abilities deserved better than the opportunities typically afforded to black Americans in 1945. Instead, he used his modest savings and the technical knowledge he had acquired to establish Washington Specialized Demolition Services, a small company providing controlled blasting and structural modification services to construction projects throughout the region. Operating initially from his brother's garage, the company struggled for recognition in its early years, often relying on subcontracts from larger firms unwilling to deal directly with a black-owned business. In 1947, Washington received an unexpected letter from James Hartford, now a civilian engineer with a major construction firm in Pittsburgh. Hartford offered a subcontracting opportunity on a significant infrastructure project, specifically requesting the specialized pressure front technique Washington had pioneered during the war. "I followed your career after our paths diverged," Hartford wrote. "Your innovations saved countless American lives. I believe they can now help build the infrastructure our growing nation needs in peacetime. This contract is small, but it could lead to more substantial opportunities if successful." This initial contract became the turning point for Washington's fledgling company. The successful completion of the Pittsburgh project led to others, and within 5 years, Washington Specialized Demolition Services had established a reputation for handling complex structural modifications that conventional demolition companies couldn't manage. By 1955, the company employed 27 people, including several veterans from the 365th Infantry Regiment. Among them was William Hayes, who had left teaching to become Washington's operations manager, and Marcus Johnson, who oversaw the company's growing fleet of specialized equipment. In the spring of 1962, nearly 20 years after his innovative technique had first collapsed a German bunker in Italy, Elijah Washington received another unexpected communication. This time, an invitation to speak at the United States Army Corps of Engineers training facility about the development and applications of pressure front disbursement techniques in both military and civilian contexts. "They finally want to hear the whole story," Hayes remarked when Washington showed him the invitation. "Better late than never, I suppose," Washington replied with a small smile. "Though I wonder how many of those young engineers will believe that a coal miner with an 8th grade education developed a technique they're now teaching at West Point." "Tell them anyway," Johnson advised. "History should know the truth, even if it arrives decades late." Washington accepted the invitation. His presentation to the assembled engineers, most of them too young to have served in World War II, was received with professional interest and respect. Several approached him afterward with technical questions and expressions of admiration for his ingenuity. One young black lieutenant lingered after the others had departed. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you, not just for your technical contribution, but for what your example means to men like me. The army has changed since your time, but we still face challenges. Knowing what you accomplished under much more difficult circumstances, it matters, sir." Washington shook the young officer's hand firmly. "The real victory isn't just in solving the technical problem," he said. "It's in proving that good ideas can come from unexpected places, and that ingenuity recognizes no color line. Remember that when you face your own challenges." As Washington departed the facility that day, he reflected on the long journey from that first improvised application in Italy to his current standing as a respected specialist in his field. The stupid trick that military experts had initially dismissed had evolved into standard practice, while the coal miner they had underestimated had built a successful enterprise, applying the same principles to peaceful construction. It wasn't perfect justice or complete recognition. The full story of the Buffalo Soldiers and their contributions remained largely untold in mainstream American history. The racial barriers that had limited Washington's opportunities before and after the war still existed, though perhaps with slightly narrower gaps through which determined individuals might pass. But standing in the spring sunshine outside the Corps of Engineers facility, Elijah Washington felt a measure of satisfaction that transcended these persistent inequities. His innovation had saved lives during the war and continued to serve useful purposes in peace. His company provided employment and opportunities for men who might otherwise have been relegated to the margins of the economy. And most importantly, his example offered inspiration to a new generation, facing its own battles for recognition and respect. The bunker that had collapsed under the pressure front of his stupid trick in 1943 had been just the first of many barriers to fall before the power of practical ingenuity. Some would take longer than others, requiring persistent pressure and multiple approaches, but as any good engineer or coal miner understood, even the most formidable structures had their vulnerabilities. The key was finding them and applying pressure at precisely the right points. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.